Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Something to Think About, an opportunity to ponder on what the Gospels tell us about Jesus and how it might influence and shape our own lives. Have you noticed how the first half of November seems to be taken up with remembering and looking back? At the beginning of the month, we remember and mark All Saints' Day, where we recall people of faith who have gone before us. On the 5th of November, we remember how a plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament was foiled. And on the 11th, at the 11th hour, we remember the end of the First World War. And on the second Sunday in November, we always mark this as Remembrance Sunday, where we bring to mind those who have lost their lives through conflict or are suffering through conflict. And we take the opportunity to pray for peace as well. With the amount of bad news flooding the airwaves about people's inhumanity to each other, the cynicism with which governments manipulate people to their own ends, and the sheer amount of suffering that humanity seems to be hell-bent on inflicting on each other, it is really hard not to get despondent and discouraged and simply give up in the face of such a tsunami of bad news. But against all this, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." So what does this mean? What is Jesus trying to say? Rather than trying to explain it, I simply want to illustrate this to you by telling you a story. And like all good stories, it begins with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a rich man who lived in the desert in the Middle East. You could tell how rich he was by the amount he owned, and especially the number of camels that belonged to him. In fact, he was so rich, he owned not 2, not 4, not 8, not 10, not 15, but 17 camels. He had led a peaceful and prosperous life, and so when he was very old and near to death, he wrote his will, explaining how he wanted to leave his wealth to his only son, his grandson, and one and only nephew. And the terms of the will were quite straightforward. One half of his riches would go to his son. 1/3 of them would go to his grandson. And lastly, 1/9 would go to his only nephew. This seemed fair. Soon after, the rich man died. Now, when it came to dividing up the camels according to the will, the 3 beneficiaries ran into a problem. If half the camels were given to the son, he would get 8.5 camels, which would mean killing a camel. If 1/3 of the camels were given to the grandson, that would mean again killing a camel so that he could get 5 2/3. And when it came to the nephew, there was no way he'd get his share unless another camel was killed. The 3 of them became so frustrated and angry with each other that they shouted and quarreled and argued and even threatened to go to war over the camels. Secretly, they began to stockpile weapons and started plotting their battle campaigns. Nearby lived a very poor man. You could tell he was very poor because he only had one single solitary camel. Although he was so poor and seemed to have no influence, he still wanted to do something to help. He wanted to stop war breaking out. He wanted to be a peacemaker. But what could he do? he decided to offer his one and only camel into the rich man's inheritance to help sort out the problem. It was a huge sacrifice for him because effectively he was giving away all that he owned. The rich man's inheritance now consisted of 18 camels. So the son, the grandson, and the nephew sat down and made their sums. Half of the 18 camels would go to the son, so that meant he would have 9 camels. 1/3 would go to the grandson, so the grandson took 6 camels. And 1/9 of 18 would go to the nephew, so the nephew took away 2 camels. Each of them had their allotted number, and to their great surprise, there was even a camel left over. And so the poor man received his camel back. He had made peace by his willingness to give up all he had, and it had made the difference. And he had not lost out in the end, because what he gave away, he received back. I just wonder what you think this story is saying about making peace. Peace isn't just about the absence of conflict. Peace doesn't happen just because we do nothing. Like Jesus said, peace has to be made. And sometimes this involves really hard work and sacrifice. No wonder Jesus called them peacemakers. And I wonder, what does this say about Jesus, who is described as the Prince of Peace? What about us? How can we be known as peacemakers? Where can we make peace this week? Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.